train 7444 is made to the part that hasn't departed yet. Its driver has bent over, attempting to connect some wires. Meanwhile, his colleagues hear the train begin to move, and it does. The train has scrap crude oil and some rain. The crewmen try to warn the engineer, but by the time he finally hears them, little does he know that right after a curve, there's a first stopped train. So he attempts to move the air brakes, but to his shock, they do nothing. And then he doesn't know what's coming until it's too late. Three cars slam through each other. The noise is so loud. Gosh, it's devastating. There's debris everywhere. As cranes come to lift up rubble and wreckage, to their amaze, they find the engineer. He's badly bruised, but he's in there. Eventually, they get him out of the debris, and he's airlifted to the hospital with severe injury. As for the freight cars and the track, they're just demolished and completely wrecked. The crude oil tankers didn't blow up until about 15 minutes afterwards, when they did. Crude oil tankers finally burnt themselves out, but by that time, the wreckage was insane. Their locomotive was buried underneath, on its way inside of a tunnel. The rear car had jackknifed it and slid into the rear tanker car. At the time, that one hadn't fully blown up yet, so when it did, it was bad. And then that one ignited. It sent the rear hopper car skidding on its way. It was a devastating mess. That totaled around $15 million to clean up. And in total, it was $16 million. An extra $1 million were added from charges from the families of people who died trying to fight the fire, or who tried to help anybody out that was still on the train. As the engineer's crew came running over, that's when they realized that they may never see him again. As for the lead locomotive, the leading locomotive was completely destroyed, or at least its cab was. It took some time, but they were able to finally release it. Although it was the most dirty. It had scratches and dust on it. And by the time they finally lowered it to the ground, it had a massive barricade which came from the hopper car. When they lifted it up, pieces fell. When they attempted to load it onto the tracks, the ride that weren't that damaged, the locomotive had no energy. Its glass had been shattered. And if it wasn't, when it was pushed back to the cat. As for the freight cars, most of them were torn or gone. That's just scrap heap. Scrap burn. Okay. Not even animals can even get close. One cat was exploring for anything it could find, but suddenly it was exploring in the wrong area. They got close to one of the tanker cars and jumped on it, but that blew the tanker car up. As the tanker car finally fell over. But with it, it had also left some debris that fell down and then shot into the air. In the end, it took a while to clean up the crash. In fact, it took a total of 13 hours to clean up the crash. As many cranes were needed. Most of the freight cars were total gone, like I said before. One of the tanker cars that was owned by Sun & Co. was the only tanker car to be salvaged, as it was rebuilt and patched. And some parts that had fallen off were put together to rebuild that Southern Columbia car that was wildly destroyed in a brutal fire. Besides that, all of the other freight cars were actually in really good condition, minus that freight car that was taken out when the locomotive slammed into it. That one was just smithereens. A crane lifted it up, and this is how the cranemen found it in disarray. It was wrecked. One side of it, one side of it was gone. The other side was also gone, but it was still holding on to the frames, and it was a total goner the next morning. There was a boxcar involved in the crash. The only thing that happened was it lost its door, as seen here. It's deemed one of the worst train crashes ever in the history of Santa Fe. As it took a long time, the 13 hours, as I mentioned, to clean it up. This is what the wreckage looks like without any freight cars. A massive pile of twisted steel. Some of it was once curved and now flattened in a miscurved shape and destroyed. Cleanup began the next morning after the crash. They had excavators come in and begin to move all of the wreckage. And then they found some pretty valuable stuff that was going to a scrap heap that they later took out. Like this thing here. It was very valuable because it went to one of the tanker cars. The tanker cars on the other train that the runaway had slammed into. But it had been taken off and put in the boxcar. This one was special because this had been in a tanker car in the 1840s that was added to a newer one. So it was put in a museum, and you can still see it today. Well, at least that was the way it was in the 1960s and the 1990s. Because after that, it was taken out of the museum, and the whereabouts are very unknown. Once that huge crab grabbers came and lifted up a lot of the wreckage to get it out of the way, especially on the tracks, as they still had freight trains that needed to come through with their heavy loads. But of course, just like Cajon Pass, there was another runaway. Some freight cars had been pushed or being taken up the past hours earlier, but they were stopped in a very small siding, so that their locomotive could get a fuel up. At the rear of the train were two tanker cars. The train began to slowly creep away before beginning to pick up speed. The train eventually was able to pick up 79 miles an hour. By the time it finally reached the curve, it was going 92, and then disaster struck. Derailed, going in excess of 92 miles per hour. Faster than the freight train that had derailed before. That was only going 89. The freight cars derailed in an instant. The tanker cars blew up. But surprisingly, they only did very small explosions that let out small bursts of fire. There was no more wreckage added to the already existing pile of wreckage on either side. As pieces were lifted up that were around the derailed freight cars, opposed to cleaning up the freight cars first, because the pieces underneath would be smoldering hot if they did that, as the fire made them burning hot. If you were to touch it, your skin would instantly be burned, and you'd probably pass out for a few hours from the heat, as it would affect your body. Anyway, after a few hours or so, they lifted the wrecked freight cars. They weren't too badly wrecked, and from there, they cleaned up the rest of the mess. Although eventually they finally gave up and just put the wreckage right by the train tracks. Because it would take way too long to clean everything up. Freight trains still pass by today. Very often indeed. One of those locomotives is Santa Fe in AWGR 779. Especially on its coal delivery, the sandy coal locomotive, because at times today, as it truckles down the tracks, but it still gives when an engineer passes over by the tracks, it still gives some worries about what happened that fateful day some years ago. Another crash like that actually did happen in the same area. It wasn't too severe though. It was only just a switching incident when a train that was being switched derailed, but the train was still going pretty darn fast and had some tanker cars. The tanker cars were the first to go off, and they slammed into the wreckage at a high speed. They slid through the wreckage, and in an instant, what was once piles that had been turned into small huts for workers if they needed something, they're now turned back into that already existing pile. The locomotive was sent off the tracks, but it derailed on the opposite side. Thankfully, no one was hurt in the incident. The tanker cars did not blow up, but they still caused a fire as they destroyed some pipelines. There was about 80 of them that the tanker cars were out of the 100. 80. Only 20, and if those cars were 200 more feet, they would have wiped out every single one. So a fire burnt hours after they cleaned up all the tanker cars. And the idea of huts was completely wiped out. Anyways, that's the end. You can leave now. Bye.